Earlier this month, I was invited to participate in a Valentine's Day pop-up at one of the boutiques that my jewelry is in, called Squasht Boutique in Ukrainian Village in Chicago. And for this event, I decided to make some porcelain heart pins with a variety of phrases, and I'm going to show you how I made these from start to finish. So first I opened my Cricut Joy app, and within this app you can actually create text for stenciling work right directly within the app, which is really handy. So I played around with a few different typefaces. This one that I'm messing with here is not the one that I ended up going with. I ultimately wanted something bold but very legible. I spent some time playing around with the different phrases for the hearts. I went with a couple that are rooted in kindness and small biz love, and a couple spicier defiant phrases too. So here you can see that I'm working with the Cricut Smart Stencil material. They have a nice measurement grid on the back that allows you to measure it by inches. Once I've cut off the correct amount of material, I then stick it to the sticky mat, and then it's ready for cutting. So I open the app back up and I get it prepared. You go through a couple settings where you select the correct material and pressure for the cutter. So I didn't see the Smart Stencil material immediately at the top of the list, so I'm just going to search it here, and luckily it's pretty easy to find and pops up as an option. So on this screen you can kind of determine what pressure you want for the blade. I usually go a little heavier. It's taken a little testing, but I think that it comes out a little crisper when I go with that setting. Maybe it's just my machine, so definitely test. And then I insert the mat and it just sort of calibrates. Then I press go on my app and it begins the cutting process, which, takes a few minutes. So you can kind of get up, get a cup of coffee, whatever you got to do, and it just runs. It's really kind of cool to watch. Once it's done cutting, it'll ask you to unload the piece. So now I've got the Smart Stencil off of that mat, and I'm just pulling out the different letters so that I can reveal the stencil. This does take a little time, especially if you have a larger design or a lot of different letters to work with. But the nice thing is, once you've got that stencil made, you can reuse it, and it's pretty sturdy material. Once I had my stencils created, I headed down to my studio and began rolling out a slab of porcelain using my North Star Polaris slab roller. I then used my Mud Tools yellow rib to smooth out the canvas texture from the slab. I work with pretty small slabs because, clay dries pretty quickly and I'm making really small pieces. Once the clay was nice and smooth, it was time to apply the stencil to the clay. So I'm just carefully peeling it off of the shiny paper back that it's on and slowly placing it onto the clay. A trick that I learned as I was moving along in this process is it's kind of nice to add a little bit of water to the clay surface before you stick the stencil down. So that might be something you want to try. For these heart pins, I worked with Velvet Underglaze Black for the lettering. I decided to do all black lettering just for consistency so that the pins felt cohesive in style. I tried a couple different sponges, but I felt that these little triangle makeup sponges worked really well for a very even and thin application. If you glob it too much, you could create a little bit of seepage underneath the stencil. So this makeup sponge works really well. I think you could get them at like Walgreens or probably on Amazon. I'll link a similar sponge below. And you'll want to go over the stencil 2 to 3 times so that you get a nice even application. One of the most satisfying parts is pulling that stencil off and seeing the lettering revealed. So it came out pretty nice. Some of the phrases that I initially was working with were a little small, so I did do some adjusting with the Cricut and getting the right size stencil. There was some troubleshooting involved. I then grabbed my heart cutter and began stamping out the different phrases from the porcelain. I'll link the cutter set that I used below too, but for this heart, I did do a little adjusting with my fingers and a small tool to get it to be the right, more rounded shape that I liked. So one thing to be aware of is you do have to do a little bit of carving on some of these letters because the stencil obviously can't account for the circle inside of an O, for example. So in a moment here, I'll show you how I did that. I actually waited for the clay to be bone dry because it was just cleaner and easier to scrape those little areas out of the letters. I tried a few different tools for this process. At first, I was working with my diamond core carving tools, and those had almost too much pressure. I tried a needle tool, and then ultimately found that this little knife tool actually worked really well for a soft scraping effect. This did take delicate hands, but I actually found it so satisfying to just do that scraping and reveal the final letters. It just was really meditative and relaxing. I put in so much thought into how I wanted to decorate these without taking away from the lettering. Something I'm working on as an artist is just being a little bit more refined and tight when it comes to my concepts. So I ultimately landed on just repeating the same pattern in different colors on each of the pins. So I worked with 3 different colorways using Velvet Underglaze by AMACO. I did the cactus green paired with medium blue. I did the medium red paired with coral. And then the last one was ultraviolet purple combined with bright yellow. So those were the 3 colorways, and I just carefully painted sort of like a starburst line pattern on each of the pins. I think I did 3 coats for each. So just going over those lines, honestly was really proud of myself with how consistent these came out, because this fine line work, it can be a little bit delicate. So this was a good project to sort of stretch myself into freestyling some new patterns, and honestly really loved how they came out. Once all the underglaze work was complete on that greenware clay, it was time for the first of 3 kiln firings. It's been such a cold winter where I live outside of Chicago, so I was a little bit worried that it would be too cold to fire my kiln, because the week before it was like in the single digits, but luckily we got up to like the 20s and 30s this weekend that I was kiln firing. I like to transport my pieces on a little miniature wear board just to make it easy, and I could lower it right into the kiln and just kind of shove the pieces off of it, carefully of course. I was firing some pieces from a class that I taught that same week in my town, so I had some jewelry to fire, and the timing really lined up with that. So for the bisque firing, I went with cone 04 and programmed my electric L&L. And then here I am the next day loading those pieces up onto a paper plate, real fancy. And I'm wearing my winter gloves because it was quite chilly this day. Once I got everything inside, it was time to add some clear glaze to the pieces. So I use a little fan brush to paint that clear glaze on the front side of the pieces. I only glaze one side because these can lay directly on the shelf. And I hold it by one corner and I leave that little corner exposed so that once the rest of the piece is dry enough, I can hold it from a different angle and just go over that one little part that I hadn't gotten to yet. After adding 2 coats of clear glaze, and letting the glaze dry, it was time to head back out into the kiln shed for the second firing, the glaze firing. So I just, again, shoved the pieces off of my wearboard and directly onto the kiln shelf, making sure that there was no glaze on the bottom sides of the piece. And for a glaze firing, I programmed my kiln to cone 6 for this type of porcelain that I use. So the grand reveal of the glazed piece, this is the red and coral combination. I couldn't resist adding a little bit of gold luster to all of the pins. Gold luster is just kind of my thing, as much as I wish I didn't have to feel the pull to add it onto like everything I make in terms of jewelry. It just makes everything a little bit more magical, so I went through the process and it moved pretty quickly because I just added a handful of little small lines to each of the pins, kind of between the different colored stripes. I hate to work with this stuff inside, but unfortunately in the winter, I don't really have a whole lot of options. But of course, I wore my 3M vapor mask and used gloves and just tried to, be as quick and safe as possible. But I do advise working with this outdoors if you can. So I brought the pins outside and gave them another firing in the kiln for a luster firing at cone 017, and here's the final results. Next, it was time to add the little pin backs. I will link the ones that I bought in the description below, but I used my Gorilla Glue 2-part epoxy to glue these onto the unglazed back of the pin. So you squeeze out equal parts of that epoxy from the tubes and you mix it for about 20 seconds. And then I like to use little pliers to handle earring backs or pin backs carefully. And I just like to dip the flat surface into the glue and get a good coating on there before pressing the backing onto the surface. I wear my vapor mask for epoxy too because the fumes from that product are also pretty toxic and not good for your lungs or your eyes. I also like to recommend wearing some safety glasses too. So now for the exciting part of assembling the final pins onto some jewelry cards. I just punched the pin right through it and secured it with the rubber clasp that it came with. But yeah, it was so satisfying to see them in their final form. I think they came out really cute. I love the different colors and phrases. Got a little squashed love in there for the store that I was going to be popping up in. We laid these out for customers to grab for free, just kind of a nice little giveaway, giving some love out for Valentine's Day. But they looked so cute in the store. There was snacks, I had my jewelry out, and it was just such a good vibe hanging out with the owner of the shop and then some folks who were bringing snacks and caviar for people to pick up in the neighborhood. If you're ever in Chicago and you want to find a really unique boutique, I highly recommend checking out Squasht. They have such an amazing selection of beautiful clothing and handmade items, and you could find my jewelry there, of course. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them below, and it would mean so much if you would subscribe to my channel so we can stay in touch.